Afternoon and welcome to this special meeting of the Board of Regents on this 20th day of June 2017. Before we begin our business as published today, I'd like to note that the work of the Presidential Performance Review Committee is still underway. The committee has met on multiple occasions, but our work is not yet complete. The committee's report will be presented once it has been finalized. First on the agenda today is the purchase of community solar garden subscription services. We'd ask Mr. Bertelsen and Mr. Stennis to come forward. I believe the board has had the opportunity to review this proposal. It is not the intention for the administration to present a slide presentation, but to be available for any questions that the board might have this afternoon. Mr. President, do you have any comments you'd like to make?
No, sir, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Mr. Bertelsen, Mr. Stennis, any comments you'd like to make or simply move to questions or concerns from the board?
Yes, sir. We'll be glad to take questions. Okay.
Are there any questions or comments from the board in regard to the solar garden that you might have this afternoon? This is an action item, and so we would entertain a motion and a second at the appropriate time.
I move approval.
Been
Second.
moved and seconded on regard to the solar garden subscription services. Is there any discussion? Is there any discussion? Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I just had a quick question. I do remember reading, I don't have it in front of me, but I do remember reading that the rate increases of the two contracts are actually not the same. Is there a reason for that?
Mr. Chair and Regent Hsu, that was there. So we put out an RFP. Each of the companies put in their own proposal. One was, and that's just how they came back. So that was their proposals back, and we evaluated them and found them all, the set of them still to be positive, even though they were somewhat different.
Okay, thank you.
Further comments, questions? If not, on the motion, all in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Item 2 is relating to the board committee structure in the future, and I'd ask Mr. Steves if he would make some opening comments. Again, the board has been privileged to see these proposed changes. Following Mr. Steves' comments, I would call on Regent McMillan for some comments as well. Mr. Steves.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, we're just going to pull up the slide deck and very briefly walk through it. But I'll just start by saying that higher education boards are called upon to address increasingly complex issues, and here at the University of Minnesota, Regents have expressed a desire to be more fully engaged with the broader spectrum of issues and to consider issues in a more holistic fashion. And in response to that, the Governance and Policy Committee has been having some discussions, and as I move to this next slide here, it just outlines your current structure. This is very familiar to you. It has 3 sets of committee meetings happening concurrently, a work session time slot, and then a Friday board meeting. The proposed structure, and I'll just note this is a sample schedule, so don't get too wedded to the times, because the times would each be set as agendas were developed. But it would move to a model where there are 2 omnibus committees, is what we've been calling them for lack of a better term. One around mission fulfillment, which would deal with academic programs, promotion tenure, admissions enrollment, student affairs types issues, outreach and engagement. The other, finance and operations, which would deal with operating and capital budgets, facilities, real estate, technology, employee compensation and benefits, those types of issues. And then a third omnibus committee, which would be the Governance and Policy Committee. As envisioned, this would continue to serve as a forum for policies that don't go through the other committees to be discussed and consider and evaluate changes to those policies, as well as consideration of governance best practices, ways to improve the function of the board. But then in addition could also play a little bit broader role in agenda development and providing feedback so that future agendas are reflecting planning throughout the year instead of just during the one time when we do planning in August. And you'll note that the audit committee and the litigation committee continue as is. However, they would have more frequent meetings. And then there would be at least an opportunity for board leadership, if they chose to do so, to have a slot where they could put a special committee. You may remember that a few years ago the board had a special committee on academic medicine, for instance. And so there would be an opportunity for those types of a committee of that nature. The proposed structure is really intended to enhance opportunities for the board to collectively focus on consequential issues, increase information symmetry between regents, and increase transparency and public access to the board's work. And this latter one would be accomplished primarily through the fact that those 12-person committees would meet in this room, enabling us to use the technology that's already here to web stream those committee meetings, to archive them on our website in a way that right now that committee work is for those who can't physically be here, that committee work is invisible. And under this scenario, that committee work would be more transparent. This next slide simply shows how the hours compare, so to speak, and I won't go through this, but I'll just simply note that the number of meetings stays the same, but within that same number of meetings, the number of hours that you would be together as a board of 12 almost doubles. And in addition to that, the audit and litigation committees both are able to meet more frequently, which we think probably right sizes that, because right now both committees struggle to fit all of the things they need to do in the time that they have. So there was a question in the Governance and Policy Committee about student representatives, and the role of the student representatives really would be unchanged under this plan, in the sense that they would continue to be bringing the student voice into significant committee conversations that the board was having. What this model does allow for is the opportunity for student representatives to rotate through the board's major committees, and as a result really gain broader exposure to a cross-section of issues. Right now, student representatives stay with one committee throughout the entire year, but often we have a situation where most student reps want to serve on the Academic and Student Affairs Committee, but only two are able to, and this rotation, we think, could be a model where the group actually works together more cohesively and also gives everyone a chance to get exposed to issues. And then finally, the resolution that's in your docket that has 4 parts to it. I'll just briefly mention what they are. So the first part of the resolution directs the chair to appoint the Audit and Compliance Committee, the Finance and Operations Committee, the Governance and Policy Committee, and the Mission Fulfillment Committee. These are called out separately because even though Audit and Compliance is continuing, it would meet on a different schedule than what's articulated in current policy, and so it's broken out into this segment of the resolution. It would maintain the litigation review, nominating, presidential performance, and the authority for special committees as is in policy. And then it would direct the board office to codify the new committee structure. It would affirm that there are 8 regular meetings per year, 2 of which would be without committees, so the committee's meeting 6 times per year. And then it would reflect also, it would direct us to reflect also the feedback we've gotten from the Governance and Policy Committee about other segments of this policy, because the committee is actually engaged in a year-long review of this policy and given us feedback on a number of sections. And so we would bring all of those changes back to the board in the fall at some point so that the board can consider the policy in totality. So with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Steves. I'd recognize Regent Cohn on behalf of the Governance Committee for comments and/or perhaps a motion.
All right, I'd like to move. We vote on the resolution before us, and also say that the Governance Committee has discussed this several times, and members of the Governance Committee seem very favorably aligned with this.
Thank you, Regent Cohn. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved in second. Discussion on the motion. Regent Simmons.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I want to thank board leadership and the Governance Committee for bringing this to us. I like it, and I'm kind of excited to get involved in it, and also thank Mr. Steves. I would like to suggest that after 1 year of implementation, we do a post-implementation review and make sure we ask beyond just the board what this has achieved for us and if we need to do any modifications. So appreciate that. I think it also may result, I don't know, may result in fewer informational items coming to before the board that we see in our committees to help us understand the work at the university. So it may be appropriate to consider more personal responsibility to get around to see more things going on our campuses. And then finally, who would vote against the opportunity to have more time for the board altogether?
Very good. Thank you. Regent McMillan, comments, please?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair Johnson and Regent Simmons. I think, speaking as your incoming chair, that's certainly my approach, is that this is a work in progress and one that we will evaluate as we go forward. I also want to recognize Executive Director Steve's excellent work here and looking for best practices and constantly challenging Chair Johnson and I to think about how we might do things differently and in the process improve how we do them. In addition to the list of outcomes or benefits that Mr. Steve just reviewed, I think a couple others are warranted here just to pull up for the board's consideration. This structure would align very nicely with the President's organizational chart. And that's a key consideration. I think it also helps us eliminate some of the overlap that we've started to find in things like, especially with governance and policy, as we work on some of our policies. For instance, the one we were talking about last week, is that properly in FSA, or is it properly, where is it? This will help us, I think, get a handle on that. And to your information point, I hope that we have the opportunity as we talk through some of this as a committee of the whole, big issues on Thursday, that Friday then is opened up for some opportunity to bring informational items to the full board rather than just 6 of us. Again, that's aspirational. Don't know that it will pan out that way, but we have not done this in a vacuum. We've consulted with President Kaler multiple times and optimistic and pretty confident it will give us some improvements.
Thank you, Regent McMillan. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Initial comment that I am also very excited about the opportunity for us as a full board. I think that there's been great work done here, and I'm excited to see where it goes. Going back to the point that Mr. Steves made regarding student representatives, and that was, I think, one of the questions that I'd had earlier, is looking at how that aligns with the current number of student reps and so on. In response to my response to the statement that it gives people an opportunity to serve on other committees, I think that's a good thing. I think, putting on my very ancient student representative hat, I think that would have been interesting. So a student doesn't end up on the facilities committee, which can have an impact, but nonetheless, it's not where a lot of the activity is for student conversations. And so I think that's a good thing. I would ask the question, have we gotten feedback from the current student reps? Are they comfortable with what it appears will be the new alignment for student representatives?
Mr. Steves?
Mr. Chair, Regent Rocha, we have not yet had an opportunity to get comprehensive feedback from student reps on this item, but what we would anticipate is that as the incoming student representatives get their orientation, we would actually talk through with them this model and solicit their ideas as well, and come to a plan for next year that is workable for everyone.
Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Steves. That's great, and I understand certainly the timing of where we are in the summer and their cycle, and it might make that a bit of a challenge. I would just recommend as we go forward that conversation start early, because it may even impact what they do in terms of the number of student representatives and from where they come and so on. And I'm guessing here, taking the liberty that I speak for all of us, that we want to make sure that the student representatives feel that they have meaningful and thorough access to the conversations that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. Regent Swigum.
Mr. Chairman, members, just very, very quickly, I completely support this new proposed structure, committee structure, and I think a strength of it is the potential, which was mentioned by Mr. Steves in the board structure, a strengthened potential of more public input and testimony, which I think is extremely lacking in my first few months here. But with 3-hour meetings, it would seem to me that we have much more opportunity to allow members of the public to come to that microphone.
Thank you, Regent Swigum. Any further comments on the Cone motion? Any further comments? If not, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion prevailed. Thank you very much. The final item on our agenda today is to take action on the fiscal year 2018 operating budget, which we reviewed on June 8th. Senior Vice President Burnett and Ms. Towson, thank you for your work, and I'll invite you to join us at the table if you'd like. President Kaler, would you like to begin?
Yes, sir. Chair Johnson, thank you. Members of the board, I will walk through this presentation at a high level for you. I will tell you that the ultimate recommendation for tuition has changed from when we presented this to you last time as a consequence of substantial conversation with many of you, and I believe we've reached a position that will be a compromise that will allow us to move forward. I will remind you, although 2 of you weren't here last fall, we received approval from this board to request a biennial increase from the state of Minnesota of $147.2 million. Within that total, in addition to programmatic initiatives, were $22.6 million in core support for FY18, an additional $23 million in FY19 for $68.2 million in total, and plus $22 million across the biennium for investing in student success. And that request was based on a framework that included a 2% increase in resident rates at all levels across all campuses. When we were asked what it would take to freeze tuition by the legislature, we consistently answered that it would take $128.6 million across the biennium to replace the core mission, student success, and tuition dollars. I'll remind you, at the end of the day, although we had by some measures a successful legislative outcome, certainly on the capital side and the operating side, we received a little bit more than we did 2 years ago and a larger fraction of the overall target. But nonetheless, we received only $9.5 million for core operations in FY18, and there's a tail to that in FY19. So we went back to work, and we made a budget that we showed you in some detail at our last meeting. But first, we went backwards. We made our work more difficult by reducing the tuition increase in the system campuses from 2% to 1%, and that cost us $1.2 million. We then proposed increasing the resident undergraduate rate on the Twin Cities campus by 3%, generating an additional $3 million. We increased our internal reallocations and reliance on other generated revenues by over $13 million, from 13.5 to 26.6. And we're spending roughly $7 million less than we'd hoped on student services initiatives and academic programs. Before I show you some additional charts and graphs, let me go to the next slide, which reminds us of what I think we are about. We want an affordable, high-quality education, excellence across all that we do, continuing reductions in administrative costs and higher efficiencies, and a strategic investment in core operational activities. Again, you've seen this chart many times. This is the all funds pie chart for our $3.9 billion budget. The internal sales, $5.9 million, and the blue is internal sales, as you would suggest, between units of the university, so it's not an external transaction. Tuition, you see, is 24.3% of our total, and the state support is 17.4%. As we look forward to a framework for new investments, we identified as a top priority a 2% merit-based compensation pool. You see that that's nearly half of the proposed increase in our budget. We also held $2 million as dry powder, as Vice President Burnett likes to call it, for FY19. We would spend that only in non-recurring dollars this year. Facilities and technology infrastructure. The state appropriation included several components and programs, including a $4 million cancer clinical trial in MinDrive, $2 million in investment in NRRI, and of course restoration of the family medicine health training. Those are part of core operations and program enhancements. We then proposed last meeting to pay for that increase in the following way. You'll see 38%, the majority of the burden is carried by the units by reallocating. That means stopping spending money on things that are lower priority than investments you would like to make. The recurring state appropriations, $13 million in new initiatives, and core operations, $9.3 million. And we proposed last meeting a tuition increase of $22.2 million. Highlights of that, again, this is from our last meeting. Resident undergraduate rates, 1% for residents on our campus, system campuses, 3% for Twin Cities. I will modify that in just a minute. Differential between resident and non-resident undergraduate rates, as you see in front of you. Graduate and professional tuition rates aligned with the market and competition. Room and board mandatory fee increases vary, and the fee breakout is shown here. You may recall that there was legislation passed around student fees requiring them to be no more than 2%, if I remember correctly, unless voted on and approved by the students. That law, which I think will be an item of some considerable discussion by this board as we go forward, is not applicable until FY19, so it does not apply now to these rates. And the numbers that you see before you on the chart. Next, please. To give you some context of history, I do believe if you plot this, you will see we've bent the cost curve on tuition. It's not yet flat, but it's much less steep than it was. You see on the Twin Cities campus, 3 years at $12,060. That reflected a really important relationship with the state legislature, in which we approached them with the idea of freezing tuition in compensation for an adequate state allocation. That worked, and we were able to do that. In total, with a 3% proposed increase, the average annual increase over the past 6 years would be 1.4% on the Twin Cities campus, and the average annual CPI in urban areas over that same period is also 1.4%. The system campuses average annual increase of 0.5% under inflation. The bottom of the chart illustrates some important information in terms of how these increases could be paid for. The gift aid that we provide to students, Pell, a Minnesota State grant, and Promise scholarships have increased each year by the amount of dollars that are there. A total increase over this period of time is $2,125, far in excess of the $862 tuition is increased on the Twin Cities campus. So students at the lower end of the economic distribution have fared better over the past 6 years. And then you'll see for most eligible, sorry, please back. Okay. For most eligible students this year, the proposed increase in Pell and Minnesota State grant runs between $120 and $1,000 depending on family income, so that would cover the tuition increases proposed for low-income families. Next, please. So we have listened to the board carefully. I recall my recommendation last meeting was a 10% increase on Twin City undergraduate rates. And in conversation with many of you, we've identified the following scenarios of moving the increase to 2.5. Back, please.
Oh, sorry.
Moving the increase to 2.5%, that costs us $1.6 million. We would do that by reducing the $2 million we held for FY19. That means we would not make some significant non-recurring investments. Should we move the increase to 2%, that requires $3.3 million, eliminating the entire reserve held for 19, increasing the challenge for us as we build the budget for 19. Eliminate $1 million of repair and restoration, and eliminate $300,000 in academic program. The bottom of the slide indicates that I will also propose that we increase the NRNR increase from 10% to 12.5%. That adds $600,000 in additional revenue. So the next slide illustrates my proposal to you today. That is changing our proposal of a 3% increase to a 2% increase, move the proposed increase in NRNR to 12.5%. The additional solutions beyond the $600,000 in the NRNR revenue is eliminating the $2 million held for 19 and reducing RNR, as I indicated earlier. So, Mr. Chair, the next slide is a resolution that reflects that that budget. The important elements are attachment 5, which is the tuition plan, which is revised to reflect the 2% and 12.5% rates that I am proposing. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. President. And prior to our discussion, we would need to entertain a motion and a second to get this resolution before us. Is there a motion?
Move approval.
Has it been moved? Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and second. Discussion on the motion of the resolution pertaining to the 2018 operating budget. Regent Rocha.
Just a clarification real quick. On the NRNR number, Mr. President, I recall that there was a difference at one point between the current students and versus incoming. How is that impacted by the number that you described?
Mr. President?
Mr. Chair, Regent Rocha, thank you for that point of clarification. I neglected to mention that. Yes, for students who are already here, we are proposing a 5.5% increase for those students who are not Minnesota residents or reciprocity students. So this, in some sense, applies to students who are not yet here.
Thank you.
Regent Simmons, did you have a question or comment?
Actually, I have a comment.
Okay, please.
May I? As we look at this budget, it's different than we looked at previously, and I was prepared to support the previous budget. So as I look at this one, it does say to me that we need to be highly, highly attentive to protecting the quality of this university, and where we have opportunity to enhance and increase the quality, we're working hard to protect access. And in order to do that, most of our costs are in people. The university is people, and we've got to be very careful to support those people with the appropriate compensation to recruit the people we need in some highly competitive markets, to retain them, and also to provide an environment where they can achieve and want to be, and where our students can achieve and want to be. And it may seem simplistic, and you may have already done it, and if so, you might even want to do it again. But that is, there's no one who understands the university better than people who live and breathe here. And to ask people, where can we take some costs out? Where are there opportunities? You're probably already doing it, and if you are, I thank you for it, because some incredibly creative things will come forward. They just do. And I hope we'll listen. I hope you'll share some of that with the board, because it's sort of inspirational to realize how much people care and how much they understand the university. But to me, that's where we take out costs. Attrition may result in a reduced workforce, which certainly would take out costs, but attrition also when someone's retiring or leaving, every occasion of that should be scrutinized. Do we still need this position, or can we do this work in a different or better way, or do we need more people doing it? I don't know. It's an opportunity that should always be taken. But we can't cut what the university is, and that is its people. So I just ask that we're highly attentive to opportunities, but yet preserving the ability of people to succeed here.
Thank you, Regent Simmons. Vice President Burnett, would you care to address any cost-cutting ideas that you might have? Because it's been talked about within the Regents. Any plans for the future cost-cutting?
Mr. Chairman and members of the board, this institution's been involved in doing a number of reallocations over the last several years that predate my arrival, and we certainly have more to go to get to the President's commitment of $90 million by next year. I would just tell you that in pulling together the pillars that are assigned to me in this new position between information technology, finance, HR, and university services, we're actively pulling together things to look at how we can operate more efficiently across these pillars because they are reporting into my position. So we'll be bringing those forward to talk with you in greater detail over the next several months. But those efforts are already underway, and candidly, with Vice President Kramer's arrival to the university, we're relooking at a number of things in a number of ways we've done business. So I would just share with you, a lot of that's already underway. That doesn't mean we're done, and continuing to look to where we can take costs out without affecting mission, without affecting things that have to be done, like compliance and adherence to federal law and adherence to IRB requirements is absolutely paramount to our success. So we take it very, very seriously. We're continuing to look for additional ways, and I believe we've brought you some details before. We put memos together, what we've done in Operation Excellence. There's more to come, and you have our commitment that even with this budget, there's a lot of work to be done to bring revenues within available with the cost structures that we have. So I would just ask your indulgence to let us continue to do our work, and we'll be glad to continue to, in the new structure that the board just voted on, bring that to the Finance and Operations Committee of the board to walk you through those things that are being done.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Burnett. Further comments, questions on the motion before us? Further comments or questions? Regents Swigum, please.
Mr. Chairman, I do have an option I would like to offer as an amendment. I don't know if that is available now. And Mr. Steves, with the President's somewhat late change here, we might have to make some changes in this. Is that possible? I know the President has given us a preliminary budget, and now he's revised it a bit. It might affect my amendment to some degree, Mr. Steves, and I'd ask you to figure that out if we could. Members, I think the President has done a good job in presenting a budget to us. I'm supportive of the President at least 99.3% of the way. Just think, members, Mr. Chairman, back in your old days of the Senate, if the governor got 99.3% of what he would propose, or if you would get 99.3% of what you would want, I'm going to offer you an option. You think you said most of the cost is people. Absolutely correct, 61%. You don't affect an institution of this size unless you affect people in one way, shape, or form of some consequences. And my other leading comment before I get to the amendment would be to Mr. Brunette, who I did sincerely love. I like this guy a lot. He probably doesn't think so, but I do. And I've got to spend a lot of time with you the last 3 or 4 months with Regent Powell. Operation Excellence is good. It's absolutely good. 68 million to date, 90 million hopefully in another year. But let's not take too much credit for that, folks. Let's not take too much satisfaction. We ought to be doing that on an ongoing basis, reallocating monies to higher priorities or better priorities without a, quote, Operation Excellence. That ought to be our work for years and years and centuries at the university. It's good, but is it something we should hang a star on? I don't think so. I don't think we should be hanging a star on it. That's my own personal feeling. Good, but it's not exactly the credit that we should necessarily be taking. It should be an ongoing process, not just a 4-year Operation Excellence. Members, real quickly, I'm going to offer a small option. It's not radical. I've been radical sometimes in the past. Sometimes I've used a sledgehammer in my life. This is nothing more than a little scalpel, a very sharp, small scalpel. And it's certainly not radical. It seems to be reasonable. It seems to be within the realm of addressing some needs. And I would also say maybe some discrepancies, some unfairness exists in the public sector. You're all well aware, I sent you out a memo last week. Maybe a couple weeks before that, I sent you out another one. I've not lobbied this effort at all. I have talked to a couple of you who have called me, but I've not lobbied. If I wanted to be a lobbyist, folks, I'd have done that 8 years ago and I'd be making $500,000, but I didn't want to be a lobbyist. I'm not lobbying it. But the proposal before you is very, very simple. I call it the 1% solution. Not a 5, not a 3, not even a freeze. I mean, those might be radical positions. This is just a very reasonable proposal to say this 1%. We have 26,000 plus employees at the state of Minnesota. It's growing every year by hundreds, even under Operation Excellence. Certainly, an operation our size can reduce our head count some. Regent Lucas, I'd like to do it smarter and get out and actually cut a program or two. Understanding every program has a supporting group. Every program has a constituency. They're going to be all over you. And it might be a smarter way to go, but I don't have the opportunity to do that, at least not with just being here for 3 months. So I'm going to say that we should look at a reduction through attrition. Not going to go to anybody and say you lose your job. Each year we hire over 5,000 people. You take out the students, it's still about 3,500 people we hire at the state, at least last year, or at the university, at least we did last year. A 1% solution is 260 people. And an operation this size, folks, I know if you went to Mayo or you went to General Mills or you went to the bank at West St. Paul or wherever, that's not West St. Paul, sorry, it's St. Paul. 1%, probably very doable and probably done every year. 1% on salary. Folks, you compare salaries between the University of Minnesota and other public sectors. And I realize that we're in a recruitment problem with competition with Michigan and Michigan State and hiring people in the private sector. I understand that. But when you look at the salaries paid at the University of Minnesota versus comparable, very comparable positions at the state of Minnesota, you would think that the state patrol would be the highest paid law enforcement folks in the state. Not so. You would think that the governor's chief of staff would not be making $100,000 less than the president of the university's chief of staff. You would think that I can go on. I don't want to embarrass people, but you know we do have a commissioner of budget and management operations at the state. It makes a little bit less than our CEO does here at the university, and you're a good man. You're worth probably every penny of it. But folks, it's not just the ones at top. But for every person on top, there's 5 or 16 or 75 or 200 people below that CEO that are making significantly more than their state counterparts too. So I'm going to suggest that we be very mild, very kind, and I've been told from the beginning, there's three legs to this stool, Mr. Johnson. You told me that make the university run. The regents, the administration, and the faculty. So I came up with this idea. 0% increase for the regents. 1% for administration to kind of come forward and maybe address this disparity a little bit, and 2% for our faculty. Now, put this all together, the savings that are proposed, I think my amendment continues with the 1% with actually a 1% reduction in tuition for our undergrad students. It kept NR at 10%. To Mr. Steves, that's where I say right now maybe I'd want to make it to the 12.5 that the president has recommended. That's fine with me. I'm fine with that. It's just a proposal. It's an option, folks. I think it's a scalpel. It would put us in better standing with the citizens, the taxpayers of Minnesota, and for sure with the legislature. For sure. We want to support our president, but we can help him just a little bit. I think we can help him. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Regent Swigum, did you move this as an amendment?
Sure. Yes.
It has been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
It has been moved and second. On the discussion, and Mr. Burnett, while we have discussion, I don't know if you need to do some recalculations based upon the President's new budget that he presented, and if you do, at the appropriate time, you could provide that information to us. Having said that, Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I just want to respond and maybe comment to Regent Swigham's proposed amendment, my bunk and onboarding mate here over the last couple of months. And I want to thank Regent Swigham for the proposal. Philosophically, I agree with many of the points in it. I agree that the task of identifying efficiencies and ways to operate better is an ongoing task, something that we have to do continuously, and not only to help us control and manage the cost of attending the university, but also to ensure that we have the resources available to invest in the core mission, which is so vital and so important to all of us, as we've heard from you and also from Regent Simmons. So I really agree with the kind of the overall philosophy that you're proposing here. What I would suggest we do is, in the spirit of identifying ongoing operational improvements and efficiencies, we look, as we said previously, we look to Vice President Burnett to develop a plan for how to address and develop these opportunities, which would include potentially some that you have raised, but also there's zero basing, there's attrition where appropriate. There's an opportunity, I think, in sourcing and purchasing university-wide. There are opportunities in terms of how we organize as an institution. There's opportunities, as you suggest, to look in more detail. I think many regions have suggested look in more detail at the various pay bands across the university. So I think there are a number of places to look where we can operate smarter and more efficiently, which in turn allows us to do a better job at managing tuition increases and preserving investments that we want to make in the mission of the university. So I think philosophically, very much appreciate your proposal. My suggestion would be that we give our new Vice President of Finance and Operations the opportunity to develop a program and plan for us to review, which I'm thinking and guessing from some of the comments that you made would probably be more comprehensive and holistic and cover more areas of opportunity.
Thank you, Regent Powell. On the amendment, Swigham amendment.
The work that you've done. I'm going to oppose the amendment, and I do understand that there's sort of a background theme of trying to peg our tuition to CPI, and that really resonates with the public. It's got great political capital. The optics are probably right, but I would submit that our financing plans, our institution is more complicated than trying to peg both our tuition rates and the state rates at CPI. So stepping back from the budget, I would suggest that our guiding principle should be around high value, not low cost. There are low cost providers in the public sector education. They should be the low cost. But we don't need a homogenized pricing and financing plan with the other institutions. That's why the founders gave us the autonomy that we have and gave us the special powers to run this business, and it is a public business. Value is built around strong investment and a focus on excellence. So our predecessors had the courage to jump tuition much higher than CPI in the last 20 years. And I would suggest that that money was pretty well spent. I know it's led us to a point where debt is higher, but there's a lot of value. And this university wouldn't have been the same had our predecessors not over-invested in the university. We have them to thank for that. I'm concerned that we're moving into sort of a maintenance kind of look for the university by going to a very low increase sort of rule. Remember, our our philanthropic base, these are people who created businesses, who grew businesses, who created value and excellence, and they didn't want mediocrity. They didn't want maintenance. So the reason we've got as much money coming in is because we have been bold. We're the 8th largest public research institution. The model depends on external dollars coming in. Here's the problem, colleagues. The federal government only pays us 75% of the cost, fully allocated cost of research. So unless we want to get out of that model, we have to find 25% money from either tuition or from the state. And I'll give you the example in front of us. Thank you, legislature and governor, for giving us a medical school education building. But our progress card calls for we are asking them to restore our rankings nationally to get back to the top 10. That's going to require $100 million of research out of that school. And that's going to require 25% or $25 million of found money. And we need the help of the legislature to do that. So the plea is we have got to be a higher priority at the legislature. And we'll demonstrate where that money goes. But it needs to go to research and needs to go to academic health. Without research, there is no commercialization, there's no startups, there's no grad jobs, there's no undergraduate research, there's no commercialization, there's no royalty, there's no litigation recoveries, there's nothing without providing that extra working capital that we need for research. And this amendment, you know, there's an implication that we're inefficient. And you saw the data earlier this month, and our employees, the university is 64% more efficient based on the number of employees we have against the revenues. And I don't know how else to define efficiency in this unbelievably complex, but that's one metric. So I would say and submit that we are more efficient. That's even including adding on hundreds of non-revenue people. So the last 20 years we've had compliance people added, monitors, people that don't bring revenue in, but we've had to hire them because of government regulation. And I'm in banking, I know something about government regulation. Well, it's visited higher education. And that's why I keep asking, let's do a study on the cost of compliance, because that's a big number. We'd be even more efficient than we were if we could identify those. So let's think, folks, we're a big business. A big business right now would capitalize on the market. We have states that are suffering. Our state is strong. So I know I'm going against the stream, but I would invest higher in this university, take faculty from those states, take market share, take students. We're really at an opportune time. That's what a big business would do. They would go the other direction than what we're going. They would heavier invest because that return is demonstrated. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. And on Regent Swigham's amendment, I'm probably most closely aligned with where Regent Powell is. I don't support tuition decreases on this campus. Those to me would be driven by competitiveness concerns. So I talked to a couple of our other campuses where we have acute competitiveness problems, but I'm not ready to support a tuition decrease anywhere right now, but I am very ready to begin embracing items 1 and 2 in the context of starting at the 1 o'clock hour on the clock instead of the 11:59 hour on the clock. And what I mean by that is when Vice President or Director Carlson and Vice President Donaldson and Vice President Burnett and President Kaler bring us the framework for a budget in the early fall, and we've been trying to back this up. Beeson, myself, others who've led the Finance Committee over time, and those concepts that I highlighted in items 1 and 2 are fully appropriate for that conversation starting in the fall so that we build a budget for 2019, which, as President Kaler said earlier, is going to be heightened by what we may act on today, the challenges associated with that. So it's an issue of timing for me, but bottom line is the business model is not sustainable when we go to the tuition well because we didn't get what we wanted from the legislature and what we perhaps deserved from the legislature, but I think getting at the fundamentals of why we didn't get that will help us get there in the future. So I can't support this in its current format, Regent Swigum, but I do fully and completely support the types of things you're getting at in items 1 and 2. It just gives you a time for me to start at the front end of the process rather than at the very end to get the administration focused on how we might do things best.
Thank you, Regent McMillan. I have a couple other regents, and then I'll call on you, Regent Swigum, again, if you have further information or rebuttal, okay?
I'm working on it, Mr. Chairman. I'm working on it.
Pardon?
I'm working on it.
All right. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may, Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask Regent Swigum a question, and then which actually may spill over to Senior Vice President Burnett, and then make a comment. Regent Swigum, so to understand, when you talk about going to a 1% compensation increase, you're not mandating a 1% across the board increased among all employees. You're still giving the administration the capacity to put more where we have, going to Regent Simmons' concerns, that we have some areas where competitiveness concerns would require more investment and other areas where maybe we are above market, where we would have more opportunity for savings. Would they still have that flexibility within that 1%?
Regent Swigum.
Mr. Chairman, Regent Rosa, absolutely. And the idea is just taking the President's proposed preliminary budget to 2%, make it 1%, but total flexibility within that.
Right.
Regent Rocha.
For priority needed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Regent Swigum. I've got broader comments about the budget, which I anticipate I'll have an opportunity to make in a moment. But with respect to the proposal, the proposed amendment, I'm understanding the concerns that Regent Powell and Regent McMillan have raised as it relates to taking this, fairly direct approach. I've actually been part of conversations of proposed amendments, and it's somewhat atypical for a board like ours to do it that way, but nonetheless, it certainly can be reflective of a desire by a board. And I would go on to say that philosophically it is very much what I think we need to do. I don't think it's as draconian as maybe it might seem. We're going to come down and draw this line, and this is what has to happen, and now you're kind of out of luck, administration, to try to administer this. I still think there's a lot of information, there's a lot of analysis that needs to be done. I'll talk to this in a minute. I've asked for some more information, but ultimately that information, by my instinct, gets us to this place, gets us to a place where we can provide this. I do want to just briefly speak to Regent Beeson's comments as it relates to this amendment. I'm looking forward to our new omnibus committees to have these discussions about things like tuition, because what you're raising is a fundamental question as to how we operate. And I'm just a little bit concerned that we end up in kind of this catch-22, where on the one hand, we're autonomous to do what we want, and we think that there's value. Certainly you can argue that our school districts in Minnesota provide great value, even though people don't pay tuition. But my concern is that on the one hand, we run to this high cost model, and then we turn around and say, but legislature, you should agree with us on our model and give us money for these other things, when the legislature continues to say we want to keep access for Minnesota kids at its maximum with low cost, but then we don't actually give them an opportunity to do that when we bury it behind hundreds of $100 million before we actually get to the tuition question. So I'll talk to that in a minute. But as it relates to this, the reason that I like what's being proposed, even though it's certainly not the ideal way of approaching it, and I would actually place some of that back to the administration and saying, from my perspective, these are conversations I've been wanting us to have to get there. In the absence of having that directly in front of me, I will support the amendment to the extent that it is going to provide the impetus for us to start moving down this conversation going forward.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. Regent Simmons, please.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I want to express my appreciation for what Regent Swigum has brought forward. I think it's thoughtful and principled. I don't agree with everything in it, and I'll come to that, but it's very helpful to stimulate this sort of discussion at the board so we can analyze and make the best decisions. I'd like to make two comments. One is I do want to draw attention to and express my appreciation, at least, for what the administration's done in savings and reallocations that have allowed us to improve and allowed us to protect people. Our investment in the oversight of human participant research was an investment, was a reallocation. It's administrative costs, and that helps protect people. That investment also in our IRBs has resulted in increased research throughput. We get our discoveries into the lives of people sooner. We improve the human condition more quickly with that investment, and we provide more economic opportunity for this state. So I deeply appreciate the success and the leadership that has been there, and I know it will continue. I have that confidence because they have a great track record. The other comment I would make is about the marketplace for our employees, our faculty and our other employees, including administrators. Our marketplace is not simple. It's really complex. And I think we have to be very careful about our benchmarks. I'll just give one example. Pick the best clinic in the Twin Cities, whatever you think the best is. And they're recruiting a physician, and we're recruiting a physician in the same field, but the one we're recruiting needs to contribute to the mission, which is research as well as education as well as practice. To retain a great producer of research, education, and practice, we have retention battles that go on. In medicine, I can assure you that there are people offering pretty great salaries, benefits, and maybe even more importantly, support at the workplace to grab our best and brightest away from us. So take the medical school only. If we undermine our ability to retain and recruit, we should forget our aspiration of turning the curve upwards on the quality and the rankings of our medical school. So I would plead that we not do this simplistically. Police force may be another good example, and I may be wrong, so this could be really helpful to you, Regent Swinga, but I know in the past, at least, we've had great difficulties with retention because of recruiting away the university's police force. And so in order to maintain a good enough force in sort of any category, but it strikes me that this has been the case, at least in police for us, we've had to step up. So I appreciate the stimulation and appreciate the thought and the principles behind this amendment, but will not be able to support it.
Thank you, Regent Simmons. Regent Anderson.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I appreciate Regent Swingham too, and we had some good discussions over the phone with this. In the spirit of what is being talked about here, I really support what Regent Swingham's doing, trying to get so philosophically, I really agree with it, but I don't think I'm ready to support it at this time, and I'll just tell you why. With Regent McMillan, he supports points 1 and 2. I support point 3. Anytime we can make tuition less costly for Minnesota kids, Minnesota students, I'm for that. Last year, I was overwhelmingly defeated, but I voted for a 2% decrease in tuition, but I understand not everybody wanted that. So I would like to see tuition go lower for Minnesota students. It's probably not going to happen, but it's something I strive for every day, so I appreciate your efforts on that. What I struggle with right now is on the second part, which is about salaries. I take your word for it that in certain areas we pay higher than Minnesota state government. But it appears to me that I've seen our peer groups, Big Ten universities, that have professors paid higher than we're paid, that our professors are. So I don't know if I need more information on that. I'm all for holding wages down, but I'm not so sure that our professors are paid more than our peer groups. Finally, as to the first point, I like the attrition part. I've had discussion whenever I lost an employee, and I didn't run a business as complex as this, I always look for ways to save money. Can we reassign what that employee did to somebody else, or 2 or 3 people, instead of hiring them? Can we find somebody who might be more energetic but will work for less? I think that has to continue to happen all of the time. All of the time, that has to continue to happen. I also worry about number one. We have asked the university to work on a enrollment strategy to gain students. I worry if we're going to lose employees through attrition and we start gaining students, do we have enough employees here? Can they be added then? Or as part of that number one on the attrition, in my opinion, gets taken care of, if we gain students and don't have to add employees, it's all net gain on the revenue. And I think we started on that path last year. I don't know if we know enough right now to see where we're at, but I think to start more so than just attrition, losing employees over that, it kind of defeats the purpose of the enrollment strategy. Those are my comments, Chair Johnson.
Thank you, Regent Anderson. Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I'm going to just quickly, and this actually comes to the original or today's President's recommended budget as well, and it really focuses on that 2%. And as I look at this amendment, the decrease to a 1% bump across all employee groups except for faculty, graduate, and undergraduate assistants. And I'm actually thinking, I think on the opposite end of the dropping from the administration, which is a leg of the stool that I think was left off, and that's the rest of the staff at the institution. And so I'm talking about the folks who are doing the work that we might not actually see. And many of those staff, you know, if we talk about wages, we might want to start at the question and premise of whether or not they're livable wages. And when we start there, if we take a $15 an hour employee, that's $31,200 a year. And for most of us, that's not livable, particularly if we live in the metro area. And so a 2% increase would be $620, and a 1% would be $310. I did that last piece of math in my head right now. And so I actually am not thinking as much about whether or not we're paying to market for our top paid folks, but whether or not our lowest paid employees are being paid livable wages. And so a 2%, in my opinion, is a question to say, is that enough? And a 1%, I'm going to just venture to say, certainly is not.
Thank you, Regent Omari. Regent Swigum on the amendment.
Trying to count, Mr. Chairman, if I'm winning or losing. I think I'm losing, Mr. Chairman. Members, this is an extremely modest proposal. If you can't support this, I don't know what I'm going to be doing here for the next 6 years, very, very honestly. I got no business being here. And that's probably going to come to a head. I'll probably be a little bit more radical next year. This is modest, rational, reasonable, certainly not harsh or not draconian in any way, shape, or form. Let me try to mention just a couple of things in response to those regents which raised a question, and maybe I should have outreached and tried to sell you on this. Maybe I should have outreached and tried to lobby it, but I just didn't think that was my role to do. Quick background. Last week after our board meeting, I went fishing with my family. I got home on Thursday night, and I had a number of phone calls and a number of emails from friends, most of which all of you know. And they said that we had to do something at the university to control costs. They encouraged me to keep going. One of them, Mr. Powell, a former colleague of yours at the university or at the business partnership, your friend. And he told me directly he and his wife have just given a gift to the university, large gift. It will be their last unless we do something in the university to control our costs. He told me directly. Another one, I don't know if he's in the business partnership or not, but you certainly know him, Mr. Powell, exactly the same words, exactly, except they hadn't just given their gift, they'd given it a few months earlier. This is the real world, folks. And we better start listening to the real world out of this pedestal of higher education. Real quickly, and thanks for not being confrontational on this, but this is sincerely from my heart. We got to do something. Regent Beeson, you talk about the high value and the efficiency of our employees, and I think it was last meeting we talked about the productivity number, which it relates to the high value. And I'm thinking about it, folks, and just think about how you come upon that productivity number. It has nothing to do with performance. It has nothing to do with outcome. It's a productivity number. It's a ratio. So you got a numerator, you got a denominator, and the numerator, if I raise tuition, everything else being the same, my productivity is going to go up. If I get more money from the state taxpayers, my productivity is going to go up. If I get more money from the $20 trillion deficit of the federal government, my productivity is going to go up. Has nothing to do with performance. Has nothing to do with output or with product. But that's how that productivity number of high value was come upon. If you can sell that to the legislature, if you can tell that to the citizens of Minnesota, you're a lot better than I am. A lot better. Regent McMillan, I think the university is a good value. I will tell you that directly. 12.4 or 12.5, whatever we're at right now, it's a good value. You got to go to school. You got to get an education. It's rewarded many times afterwards in life. But what a great message, Regent McMillan, if we could reduce that tuition by 1%. And in a very modest way, we've come upon a way to be able to maybe do that. I think it's a great message to students. I'd love to go back to the legislature and be able to say that. You're going to have a tough time, Mr. Chair, next year if you don't do something. If you just accept the budget the way it is, you're going to have a tough time getting that $10 million base back, I can tell you for sure. Regent Simmons, there is a marketplace out there. I find it interesting when I talk to members of the University of Higher Education, they want the marketplace to be downtown or Purdue or Michigan or Ohio State or someplace when they're talking salary. But when they're talking fringe benefits, then they want it to be the state of Minnesota, which has very good fringe benefits, by the way. They're trying to play both sides. And that doesn't necessarily work, or at least it doesn't work, and it's not consistent in my mind. We do pay significantly higher than our counterparts in the public sector, significantly. And again, I don't want to, I'm not picking on people. They're all my friends. I suppose they all hate me now, I like Bernie. Bernie, I thought I saw him walking. He's a great guy. I like him a lot. I so wanted, when I told him I wanted him to get that job at IT, it's a $4 billion operation here, right? State of Minnesota is like 40 billion, comparable. 4 billion, 40 billion, comparable jobs. We pay our IT director at the state Department of Administration, I assume the job description is somewhat the same, over $100,000 less. Now, maybe how we get those people at the state, I have no idea, because they're really good. And I tell Vice President Klatt, you got to be hiring from the state auditor, from the legislative auditor. Hire those people. They're really good. You don't have to go downtown. Hire those folks. And Regent Anderson, this has been said before, and I think it's really true about the tuition. The best form of student aid, what is it? Low tuition. Best form of student aid we can have. Members, this is modest. Modest. Reconsider your position. Let's help the president out. We can help him. He doesn't like me now, but we can still help him.
Thank you, Regent Swigum. Further comments on the Swigum amendment? Further comments? Further comments? If not, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Aye. The motion does not prevail. On the resolution for the 2018 annual operating budget, further discussion. Regent Cohen.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I've been waiting all this time while you've had the discussion on the amendment. Anyway, I first want to say thank you to Regent Beeson. I thought you delineated some points which I thought were extremely important to consider for this board. One of the things about our university is that it is high value. And my sincere hope is that we continue making it so. I, too, Regent Simmons, was prepared to support the last budget. As I said last time, to me, a 1.4% over 5 to 6 years average of cost of increase is extremely reasonable. And that's what the CPI was also. So if that's one of our goals, the 3% increase for tuition, maintain that. I would prefer a recommendation from the President, if we have a change, to 2.5% rather than 2%. I think it's important to leave some money in the 2019 budget, and this eliminates the couple $1 million that had been left with 2.5% or 3%. I strongly prefer a 10% increase rather than 12.5% for the NRNR students. I think they bring great diversity to our institution. Many of those students stay in Minnesota and help Minnesota, and so I think that's very important. However, I am going to support this recommendation.
Thank you, Regent Cohen. Regent Rocha, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start by repeating that I'm very happy with this new process. I think today having an hour on the docket might have been a little optimistic, but the fact that we've been talking about this over a number of months, and I think we're really starting to get down to some more of these issues. I think we're going to get to some of the topics where we're actually elevating that conversation. We'll not always agree, but certainly we're talking about the right stuff, and I really appreciate that. I'm a little disappointed over these last couple of weeks. I had expectation of maybe getting a little more data in response to what I had requested, and I know we had spoken over the last a few days ago, actually, and I thought I'd be getting a little bit more data, but I also understand that there's a lot going on, and so I'm kind of working without that, and hopefully we'll be able to get that developed for this next cycle, and I'm talking about specific information about employee data and so on. We talk about, Mr. President, you mentioned, and I really feel like I have to talk to this because we continue to talk about the legislature as being somewhat of a villain in absentia, as not having provided the resources that we need. But when you look at what we were actually provided by the legislature, and then the number that you had described that we would have, what we told them we had to have to keep tuition flat, we don't need $70 million more to have kept tuition flat. There are a lot of other priorities in there, and so from the legislative standpoint, putting on a legislative hat to the extent that those of us who've never sat in the Capitol in that role, that doesn't make a lot of sense. It's if you really wanted to keep tuition flat, you could say, okay, this is what it'll take, and then these are our other priorities, and the legislature can respond to that. So again, I think that there's a strong desire over there for Minnesota residents to try to maintain accessibility through keeping costs down, and the money will flow. But Mr. Kramer, you and your colleagues will be able to, I think, help us get that message through so we can do better in the future, because it really wouldn't have taken much for them to be able to provide us what we needed this time around. We just didn't ask for it in a way that was successful. The challenge with that, of course, is if we do it this way, ultimately you end up sort of goading the legislature into doing everything by state special. And it goes, talking about the autonomy and the founders, identifying this board as being the proper receptacle for the authority to make decisions. That'll be kind of taken away if the legislature doesn't feel like they have access, to their priorities. And I think that would be a bad path for us to follow down. You also mentioned, Mr. President, you talked about the fact that when we passed the supplemental budget request, it was on the basis of a 2% increase. I appreciate that, but it's a little bit of a double-edged sword there. That means at the point we have that discussion now, I'm going to feel, and I think other members would have to feel compelled to have the full-on tuition debate at that moment. So I don't want to feel like supporting the request in any way sort of, locked me into saying this is what I support as a tuition rate. My perception all along is that we have a lot of work to do to bend the curve back against the last 20 years of tuition increases. So I just want to make that clear as we go forward. I personally think that as we look at things like compensation for our most valuable asset, our people, and tuition rates, I think we should have benchmarks that we follow. We've done a great job with the dashboard and showing various things, but and I've said this before, but inflation should be the cap on tuition increases, and it should be the floor on compensation increases, right? And then if you've got a compelling reason to go past those benchmarks, I think that's where we should start. That's one of the reasons why I like what you're doing with this, Mr. President, because it's getting us, we're starting at a much closer point, and I think that's a good thing. But then there's some other sort of political bases, and I think those have been covered by Regents Fiscal, that would give us a basis to say, a small amount of change here could yield a pretty substantial change in the relationship with the legislature that will make the next cycle a lot easier for us. So what I thought was interesting in the discussion about the amendment, and I love the fact that we're having this substantial conversation, is Regent Simmons, Regent Omari, and I think Regent Beeson, you talked about this a little bit as well, where you were kind of swinging at the piñata. We don't know where it is. That's the problem. I completely agree, and one of the things that I've said, Regent Omari, is that when you look at compensation, if you come to me and say, I want a 10% increase for our lab workers who are earning less than $10 an hour, you're not going to have to argue very hard to me. I agree with that. But that's not what we're talking about, because we don't have that data. We don't understand what those bands are. And I completely agree with Regent Simmons. There are certain categories of faculty where we are in a competitive market, and if we want to meet certain rankings and so on and be productive in certain areas, there needs to be an investment there. But there are a lot of areas where Regent Fiscal, my instinct is he's absolutely right, that there are some areas where we could be a little bit more efficient. And that's not at all an attack on those employees, but it's the reality of our job, and that's why this job's hard. Because you have to be able to say, we're going to take that hard look and we're going to make hard decisions even though it's not my money. It's not my stock, directly. I am an interested party because I'm a citizen of this state, and now I'm in this position representing millions of citizens of this state. So we need that data to have the conversation that you guys are having, and I think it's unfortunate if we have to have that decision based on the hunches, because what I hear Regent Fiscal saying is, if the default is we're all okay, we're going to continue to be inefficient in ways that many, many people perceive outside of this building. But you're saying we can't make the assumption that everybody's overpaid and inefficient. So the way we sort of bridge that gap is we get the competent information from our staff, from our HR folks and our administration, so that we really understand where those differences are and start to be a little more sophisticated in how we allocate hundreds of millions of dollars. I do want to say that one of my concerns about the budget as it is that I still think that we've got a problem with our system campuses, and I think Regent McMillan touched on this briefly. We don't have, we're not competitive for what they're offering. The Twin Cities, it's so different, and it's one of the reasons why we shouldn't be aggregating enrollment by residents. We shouldn't be doing all that, because the Twin Cities has a different kind of market. Our system campuses have capacity. We're turning away many, many students on the Twin Cities campus, and I think we have to recognize that. And I feel as though the tuition model that's reflected in this budget continues that problem for those system campuses, and I'm hoping that as we go forward we can have a real honest conversation and a clear conversation with business principles indicating whether we could actually have an increase in revenue by a decrease in tuition, because you'd have additional students and serving more people both from within the state and outside of the state. I want to just respond a little bit to something that Senior Vice President Burnett said. You talked about if we cut much more in our administrative cost side, we've got issues like compliance that we have to deal with. I don't know that that's fair. I don't know that anybody at this board would ever suggest that we should drop compliance any more than we would drop heating buildings in the wintertime. I mean, there's some things that are so fundamental and so critical that they're going to continue. But that, I don't want that statement to say we should stop looking. And I don't know that that's what, I'm certain that's not what you're saying, but by using those as examples of why we have to keep administrative costs where they are, I think that that oversimplifies the matter, and it gets away from the fact that there are, clearly areas where we can continue to look and find those kinds of savings. I do want to say that the last thing I'll mention going into this is I still think we got to get a handle on this tuition policy, and I think that this is ultimately going to be a place where the board is going to just have some disagreement among various members. I've had very good conversations with President Kaler and others about what we're actually trying to do. We want to make sure that we're respecting the bargain that we have with students who are already here and came here with a certain expectation, but also recognizing what all of our peers are doing and what the expectations of the legislature and the citizens of the state are in relation to our students going to other states and other states' students coming here. I still think that we're hurting the university reputationally, funding from the state, and I would use a quote from there was a Kathleen Martin had provided some feedback, and as best I could, having had it for a very short time, I've tried to read all the commentary from people that weighed in on the budget, and people are very thoughtful in their perspectives, some of which I wholeheartedly agree with, and some that I don't necessarily agree with, but respect the fact that they have their positions. But she states, only when the undergraduate level academics are of the same caliber, referring to Minnesota, only when the undergraduate level academics are of the same caliber as the University of Michigan do we have the right to charge the same tuition prices as the University of Michigan. That's the perception, folks. I would never concede that the University of Michigan provides a better undergraduate education than the University of Minnesota. But this is one of our own making this statement. So I think that that's something that we have to address. I don't believe this budget does it as quickly as it needs to get there. And I'm looking forward to a conversation this fall, Mr. President, about trying to address that in a more deliberate way. So that being said, you could predict my frustration that I don't have a system-wide strategic plan fully baked against which I can weigh this budget. That's kind of strike one for me. Strike two is I do think we have to do more to intentionally and independently keep our tuition down as a reflection to the legislature that their investment is going to yield that access. That's strike two. And the lack of clear data on how we're sending out hundreds of millions of dollars to our staff in a way that reflects that there are staff that clearly need greater increases, and there are some areas where we can gain some efficiencies. Between those three items, I'm not going to support this budget with the statement that it is a vast improvement over what we've had in the past, and President Kaler, you're really close to getting me on one of these things. So thank you.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. Regent Lucas.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. First of all, I'd like to say how glad I am that Regent Swigum joined this board. You've, to me at least, challenged me to look at things a different way, and I think that will serve us well as we move into the next budget in 2019. So I thank you for your diligence and your hard work, and I think it will serve us well. I do want to say that plugging holes with NR increases is something that I think is not wise. It's money that we don't know for sure will be there, and it discourages us from being the kind of institution that attracts talent from other states, which as a state we badly need better and more talent, and I think keeping the NR lower helps us to do that. I think when the decision was made to lower NR way back, it was a wise decision. We've all profited greatly from that, and I think we play a little bit with fire when we try to plug holes with NR to see what's going to happen. I'm disappointed too that we had to land at 2.0 for the increase because I think it cuts into too much muscle. But I'm going to assume that as we approach the 2019 budget, we'll have new ways to look at things and we won't have to sacrifice the kind of reach for mission that Regent Beeson talked so eloquently about.
Thank you, Regent Lucas. Further comments and questions on the 2018 annual operating budget? Further comments or questions? Further comments or questions? Regent Omari.
Thank you, Regent Johnson. I've long took a position, let me start with this premise. I think everybody on this board agrees that NR tuition should go up. The fundamental disagreement is how fast. And so I have two classes of data that show at approximately a 7 to a 7.5% increase, application numbers do not change. When we signaled a 10%, application numbers went down, yield stayed approximately the same, which I think is now, we're getting more data in to show that we're essentially sending the signal that those who can pay for it will come, and those who can pay for it is who we will take. And that to me is a fundamental value that I will not support. And so the 12.5% NR is a large jump that I don't agree with, and everyone knows that. So I will not be voting in favor of what I actually think is a relatively good and well-built budget, but there's a fundamental principle that I cannot support, and I say that recognizing that we have faculty that we need to pay who are field shapers, and we have staff, and on and on and on. So I know it's complex, but I will not be supporting this budget.
Thank you, Regent Omari. Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Just a few brief comments. First of all, this budget is not all that I would have wanted, particularly in terms of tuition increases in the Twin City campus, which I think are still too high. I would be much more comfortable with something that is in line with inflation, which I think is lower. Also because it, as we've already discussed in this conversation, the budget lacks clarity on what we're going to do to continue to find efficiencies that, in my view, allow us to do two things, which I think every regent is passionate about. One, controlling tuition and thereby encouraging access, but two, allowing us to continue to invest in mission critical activities. And so we haven't really articulated how we're going to do that. But as Regent Rocha said, I think, and I'll take your word for it, we're making progress. The numbers are improving, and I think we're talking about the right things. And so with those thoughts in mind, I would support this budget.
Thank you, Regent Powell. Further comments, questions on the 2018 operating budget? Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I'm not sure what the final legislation said about or higher ed legislation said about tuition freezes. Was there a mandate for MnSCU to freeze tuition and then encouragement or some type of language around encouraging us to freeze tuition?
President Kaler, clarification, please.
Chair Johnson, Regent Hsu, my memory, and I will look to phone a friend and Vice President Kramer if I'm wrong, is that the MnSCU four-year schools are planning a 3.9% tuition increase this year and a tuition freeze next year. The two-year schools, I believe, have a 1% increase this year and a 1% increase next year. There is language that requests us, because it's politically easy to do, that we hold tuition flat. But we, of course, are not required to do that.
Thank you, President Kaler. Regent Hsu?
Well, and since the legislature is encouraging that, this wouldn't be a budget meeting if I didn't try to amend the budget to get a freeze for in-state students at, I guess, all campuses. And I don't have, is the option given to us, is that for all students or is that for just the Twin Cities students in our materials?
Regent Hsu, you're asking a couple of questions. One is, what is the cost of a freeze across the wide spread of the university?
I think there was an option in here, and I'm just questioning whether it's for everybody.
No, I don't think so.
Is that just Twin Cities?
Senior Vice President Burnett, can you shed some light on the issue of a freeze?
Mr. Chairman, Regent Hsu, on page 86 of the original budget we brought forth, in attachment 13, we brought budget balancing scenarios with a 0 incremental resident undergrad tuition increase, which showed that would put an $11.2 million reduction from the budget as stated, before the reduction that was recommended today by the President. So this was as budget brought forth last time, but it's $11.2 million across all 5 campuses.
Regent Hsu?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senior Vice President Burnett. So that would be based on it's not based on the current recommended budget, but it's on the old one. Is it updated since then or not?
Vice President Burnett?
Mr. Chairman, Regent Hsu, it hasn't been updated. No, this would be against the original budget with a 3%. So it was the delta between a 3% for the Twin Cities and 1% for the system campuses was, if we went 0 on all 5 campuses, it was 11.2 is what we projected for you.
Thank you. Regent Hsu?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, what I was going to do is move one of the options, but it doesn't seem like there is a freeze option with the new numbers presented by the President, although maybe it's only a $600,000 difference based on the 10% NR increase to 12.5%. Would that be close?
Vice President Burnett?
Mr. Chairman, Regent Hsu, actually it'd be $8 million more because as opposed to 2% on the Twin Cities campus, it would be 0. So you have to pick that up plus the revenue loss on the 4 system campuses. So it would be roughly $8 million less.
Regent Hsu?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I will move that we freeze undergraduate tuition for all students on all campuses, and I'd like a roll call vote.
It has been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and second. Discussion on the motion. Regent Simmons.
We have a motion on the floor. This is not an amendment. This is a new motion. I think we first vote on the motion on the floor.
You are correct, Regent Simmons. We have a motion. This would be an amendment.
I'm amending.
This is an amendment. Amendment to the resolution.
I probably just don't know Robert's rules well enough, but that strikes me as a pretty substantial, that would classify as an amendment because it changes the whole budget.
That is correct, but it is an amendment. Amendment to the budget resolution, a 0 increase in tuition across the entire University of Minnesota. It's been moved in second. Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Regent Hsu, do you have any ideas on how we make up for the revenue?
Regent Hsu?
Oh, I have lots of ideas. It's almost infinite. There are a number of ways to.
Let me rephrase. Can I rephrase?
Regent Omari.
Can you show us how we'll balance the budget given the amendment?
I think the option.
Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the option basically does it, although there might be some slight adjustments to doing that.
On the Hsu amendment. Further discussion. There's been a roll call requested. Mr. Steves will take the roll call.
Regent Anderson.
Can you read the exact resolution?
The resolution and Regent Hsu, or the amendment to the resolution is presented that a 0 increase of tuition across the University Minnesota, all campuses for 2018.
For residents.
Students.
Undergrad resident students. That is correct, Regent Hsu?
Correct.
I have a question first. May I ask that?
We're on a roll call, but I will grant you the question.
Before I can vote yes, I need to know how we would pay for it. I guess that's I kind of wanted to get it on the table and discuss that.
Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I'm not mistaken, was it Amendment 13?
Attachment 13.
Attachment 13. What page is that on?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Burnett.
members of the board, Regent Hsu, Regent Anderson, in the scenario, we put ways to balance the budget, suggested potential ways to balance the budget under that scenario. It included reducing compensation to 1% and a number of other investments being pulled back. So the only way you can get a revenue loss of that magnitude in this budget is to, at least in the scenario we built, not that there couldn't be multiple other scenarios, was to take the comp pool from 2 to 1.
We are now ready for the roll call vote on the Hsu amendment. Mr. Steves, the roll call, please.
Regent Anderson?
No.
Regent Anderson votes no. Regent Beeson?
No.
Regent Beeson votes no. Regent Cohen?
No.
Regent Cohen votes no. Regent Hsu?
Yes.
Regent Hsu votes yes. Regent Lucas?
No.
Regent Lucas votes no. Regent McMillan?
No.
Regent McMillan votes no. Regent Omari?
No.
Regent Omari votes no. Regent Powell?
No.
Regent Powell votes no. Regent Rocha?
Yes.
Regent Rocha votes yes. Regent Simmons?
No.
Regent Simmons votes no. Regent Swigum?
Yes.
Regent Swigum votes yes. Regent Johnson?
No. The motion does not prevail on a vote of 9 ayes and 3, it's 9-3. The motion does not prevail. On the motion of the annual operating budget, further discussion. If not, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. The motion prevails. Before we adjourn, I would like to make a few brief comments. I'd like to extend a heartfelt thanks to each of you, my colleagues, for giving me the opportunity to be your chair for the last 2 years. I'd also like to thank President Kaler, your entire administration, for your partnership in advancing the University of Minnesota. But also extend my deep appreciation to Mr. Steves and the entire board staff for their work and dedication and the support they have provided Regent McMillan as vice chair and myself. As noted in our June meeting, I wish to extend our best to Regent McMillan and Regent Powell as they begin their terms in July. With that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting.
So moved.
It has been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you very much.